It's a few minutes after 10, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone. And it's nice to see a few clouds and maybe some rain here the last few days. And it looks like this weekend might even be more productive, so let's pray for that. Next slide, please. Here's some meeting logistics. This is the second meeting of the Rural Groundwater Committee, so I appreciate everybody online that's attending and those in the audience, and of course our committee members here today. A few of the meeting logistics. Please note that this meeting is being broadcast via webinar and is being recorded. The meeting recording materials will be posted to the council committee section on the webpage, so I want to make sure that those that are listening in, the previous subcommittee meetings, the notes, and the presentations should also be posted on that council webpage so that you can keep up with what's being discussed by the committee and the subcommittees. Only members of the committee members will be able to unmute themselves to participate in today's meeting. For those participating virtually and committee members participating virtually, please turn your computer cameras off unless you are unmuting to speak. And if you have any technical issues, please call the DWR help desk. And that phone number is area code 602-771-8444 or email tickets@azwater.gov. Oh, and also, yeah, Trent just reminded me, be sure when you want to speak, be sure to turn on your mic and speak into the mic for committee members here around the table. Next slide, please. Again, welcome everybody, and I guess what I would ask at this point is if Trent could do a roll call for committee members, please.
If you're here, please turn on your mic and let us know. If you are an alternate for someone, also let us know. And if you're online, unmute yourself and let us know you're listening in online. So Paul Brierly.
Present.
Maria Dadgar.
Jay Tompkins attending on behalf of Maria Dadgar.
Ron Doba.
Present.
Sandy Favorites. Jamie Kelly.
Travis Lingenfelter, alternate for Jamie Kelly.
Senator Seneker.
Grant Hanna, alternate for State Senator Seneker.
Chris Kuzdas.
Present.
Sharon Megdal. And if she's not online yet, I know she will be joining us just a few minutes late. Haley Paul.
Here.
Karen Peters.
Here.
Sarah Porter. Stephanie Smallhouse.
Here.
Abe Springer.
Present online.
Craig Sullivan.
Present.
Tom Torres.
Present.
Representative Stacy Travers.
Here.
And Chris Udall.
Matt Baer as alternate for Chris Udall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. Next slide, please. Today's meeting agenda. This will very much follow the subcommittee meeting agenda. Because we ran over at that subcommittee meeting, and I'll talk about this under discuss proposed concepts, but we will be suggesting a homework assignment for all of you that we believe will provide a bit more effectiveness with meeting outcomes and discussion, because if you recall at the last meeting, we went into a lot of detail on one issue and felt as if we didn't have much time to address many of the LGSA components where we're going to have to delve in a lot more detail, but I'll talk about that a little bit later in today's meeting agenda. But as you can see, we're going to again remind everybody about the focus and the objectives of the Rural Groundwater Committee. I think it's important. You're going to hear that at every meeting. We'll provide some committee updates. I'd like to provide a little bit of background on where we've been and how we've got to the spot that we're at today. And then we'll have Jay provide information on groundwater basin data review, and that was really information that you've all ask for additional data and information regarding aquifer conditions in these basins across Arizona. And then we'll discuss the proposed concepts, and we've narrowed those down to 2. And then talk about upcoming meetings and next steps, and then, of course, adjournment. What I would like to do is welcome a couple of other DWR employees that are sitting here at the table. We have Jay, who's our chief hydrologist. Ryan, I'm sorry. Ryan, who's, sorry, that's, I did it to Haley at the last meeting. Well, it's the gray hair, I guess. But and then we have our 2 attorneys here. We have Nicole and we have Ben sitting here at the table together with us. So next slide, please. These are but reminders, again, on the problem that we're here to address and the objectives we need to meet. And as I mentioned, we're going to be mentioning these at each meeting. So next slide, please. The rural groundwater situation, what are we here to address? Outside the active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas, there is limited regulatory framework for managing groundwater. There are no requirements for meeting and reporting groundwater use outside the AMAs and INAs. Some of the groundwater basins are experiencing significant growth in groundwater use, and many communities are facing aquifer depletion with limited access to renewable supplies and no tools to manage the groundwater declines. And there are increasing calls from folks throughout the state for a framework that will assist rural communities to manage their groundwater resources. Next slide, please. By December, what are the objectives and then the roles and the goal of this committee? By December 2023, to develop policy, legislative, and other actionable recommendations for the governor that provide a groundwater management framework that assists these rural communities to manage local groundwater resources, protect water users, and sustainably manage those aquifers. These recommendations will assist rural communities outside the AMAs and the INAs in managing local groundwater resources and mitigating further aquifer depletion. These recommendations need to be broad enough to apply to any groundwater basin management needs and customizable to be tailored to a basin's unique characteristics. So it's important that you understand what the goal and objective is, because as we look at the recommended actions and some of the concepts that we're considering, they very much support the Groundwater Committee goal and objectives. Next slide, please. So committee updates. I'd like to spend just a few minutes going over what we've done to date as background and support to understanding where we're headed as a committee. So next slide. The first Rural Groundwater Committee meeting was held June 29th. It was really to focus the group on the goals and objectives of the committee, and we have reviewed those already today. Recommendations will need to complement the objectives and provide actionable solutions to address the groundwater management challenges, as I mentioned previously. Administratively, we provided the structure, process, and timeline for the group. And keep in mind, the timeline is December 23rd, so we don't have a lot of time to move forward on this. But action is needed immediately. Overview included high-level review of use, number, and the location of wells. We also provided perspectives on challenges in a few select groundwater basins, in particular the Wallapai, Wilcox, and Douglas basins. And then we also provided some overview of recent groundwater management concepts. You have the groundwater conservation areas, rural management areas, and local groundwater stewardship areas that have been proposed as potential management options for rural groundwater areas. And then we also included other options such as the AMAs and INAs, and then we compared those against one another and provided a matrix where we identified the management tools that were identified in each of those programs and compared those. What it did reveal is that there's a lot of similarity between many of these programs. We also included a starting point proposal and really provided that to the committee as a proposal to initiate some initial thought and discussion on the requirements for our program to address the challenges in those basins that are experiencing overpumping. We proposed forming a subcommittee to work on developing a program, and then we requested input from the committee members, and due to that input, members suggested a short, medium, and long-term type categorization approach for program actions and for the subcommittee to work on. Next slide. So at the first rural subcommittee meeting on July 11th, from this meeting, we asked for input from the subcommittee on the concepts and actions discussed, perspectives, and any further details, with primary focus during that meeting on the near-term items, since those are recommendations that we can make to the governor today. We asked for ideas on statewide measuring and monitoring, DWR's support of an LGSA type approach, since it supports closely the objectives of the committee. It's broad, supports individual basin needs, somewhat customizable, allows for local input and planning outcomes and accountability, and focuses on managing aquifer conditions through local water user input, and also includes oversight and direction and approval by the department. Another outcome was discussion on conditions across the basins, and if the department had more data they could share with the subcommittee. Next slide, please. So for the August 9th Rural Groundwater Subcommittee meeting, we had a review of the groundwater basin data, and then we went into discussions on the concepts. We narrowed down the concepts to 2 focus areas: measuring and reporting, and framework for managing the rural groundwater system. Most of the time on these narrow concepts was spent on the measuring and reporting component. And so we'll talk about how we want to be more effective with these meetings, and I'll discuss that a little bit later after we have an opportunity to talk about the review of the rural groundwater basin data. Next slide, please. So much of today's meeting is going to be focused on what we did at the last subcommittee meeting. Today we'll provide, of course, a presentation on the groundwater situation across Arizona, the rural groundwater basins. And this is a repeat for those of you that attended the subcommittee meeting, but for those of you that did not, the last subcommittee meeting, those that didn't attend the last subcommittee meeting, or those of you in the audience or participating virtually, the presentation provides further details on aquifer conditions in these basins that I believe you will find not only interesting in what the data provides us, but also provide you a much better understanding on the extent of the issue and where the priority areas lie. So with that, and if there aren't any questions from committee members, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ryan for his presentation on groundwater basin data review.
Thanks, Bruce. Jay here. No, just kidding.
Sorry.
My name is Ryan Mitchell. As some of you already know, I'm the chief hydrologist here, so I lead the technical branch of DWR. And the slides that I have are a general overview of some of the rural basins and showing and comparing water level rises and declines and looking at a 20-year time period. Next slide, please. For those that were in the subcommittee meeting, this is a new slide that I added to this deck because I think it helps to show where we have all of our index wells. Because we're going to be looking at a subset of this larger collection of well data, it's important to show you guys. We do have over 1,700 index wells across the entire state. Our field hydrology staff and field services staff go out and visit these sites annually, quarterly, semi-annually. We have about 135 that are equipped with pressure transducers. So those are automatic data loggers that tell us what the depth of water is at all times. And of those 135, typically you would go around and plug your computer in, download the data, and come back in 6 months, do it again. But 80 of them have telemetry, which is a way of sending a radio signal with the data every day. So if you go around and look, like poking around the GWSI groundwater site inventory web map, you'll see a different icon for the wells that have transducer data and the ones that have significantly more data points because they record multiple times in a day. This map also has a color scheme to it. So the blue wells are the wells that we go to at least once a year. The red wells are quarterly, and the green wells are semi-annually. So in addition to adding new index wells, which is one data gap that we'd like to continue to expand on, we can also do an increase in frequency. So if there are areas that we go to annually that are of interest, we can bump that up to semi-annually or quarterly if needed. And this map and all of the water level data that we have is available at that link. So that link will take you to the groundwater site inventory interactive web map. So anyone can poke around, you can zoom into your areas, you can click on wells and see what the water level data looks like and what we have. I'd also quickly take a moment of appreciation for the field staff, because this is a big effort. It's a big state, a lot of windshield time for those guys, and they put in a lot of work to collect this data. Another note too, that maybe you guys can pass along to your constituents and interested parties. If property does change and there was an index well on there, ask the new owners to please update their ownership information so that when our guys need to go out there, they're calling the right person. Next slide. Yeah.
How many out of that 135 or 215? How many are those, thank you, concentrated? Are they all sort of concentrated in specific areas, or how are they spread? Are they all in Maricopa County?
No, they're spread throughout the state, but they're typically in areas of interest. So whether if something is, let's say it's a shallow monitor well that's near a stream that's ephemeral, that means it doesn't flow continuously, it flows seasonally. We would have a recorder there that we want to take a reading more than just once a year, because as surface waters flow through, that well will respond to the rise and the fall of some surface water, right? And if you only go out once a year, you'll get a very different reading depending on what time of the season or time of the year that you go out there. So we try to pick the sites where having more continuous data is more accurate or representative. They are, of course, clustered where these concentrations of urban centers and AMAs are typically where most of them are. It's a technology that's been around for a very long time. Pressure transducers, it'd be nice to have more of them throughout the state. It means less, quarterly visits by our staff and more continuous data. But that's just a transition to digital, really. But yeah, Paul.
Just a quick clarification. These monitor wells, are they in use and being pumped, or are they just a static?
No, one of the primary criteria for selecting an index well, because an index well can be one that was purposely installed just to monitor water levels. It could also be an old well that's not being used, it's out of service, and it's sitting there capped. We'll get permission sometimes to come and collect a water level from it. But you do want to stay away from pumping water levels because you're getting a different reading, right? You're actually looking at two things: the aquifer's transmissivity into the well and the well's efficiency. Those are the things that you get from a pumping level. What we really want are the static levels, so the regional water levels. So the vast majority they're typically always collected when there's no nearby pumping. And if there is nearby pumping, the guys in the field will flag that data point. So if you open up on the GWSI web map and click on a well, you see the water level data for a trend. Then you see a big drop in a red dot and it goes back up. If you click on that red dot, it says note pumping nearby, so it's still important to get pumping level data for aquifer characteristics like transmissivity, but that's not the intent of this monitoring site or collection of wells. Our index line is more for baseline study and documenting. Any other questions on this slide? All right, next please. So now this is a set of data that I think is telling. So when asked to present to this group, we want to know what the rises, declines, what are the basins doing, what are their water levels doing across the state? And that is a trickier question to answer than just a yes or no. It's not a binary thing. Water levels in a single basin, you could have extreme decline where you have a pumping center and there's a localized cone of depression. You could have a bunch of decline in that area. You could have some shallow wells that are near some surface spring that might show a rise. So even in a single basin, you'll have a lot of variability of what's going on. So the best way to show you guys this water level data over a period of time is to give it to you in a way that's like a data visualization so that you guys can comprehend a whole lot of data in just a small little icon. So the data we're going to be looking at, here's the credits for it. Open File Report number 20 was published in April. There's the link to the publication on our website. It has water level change for a whole bunch of different periods. But the one set of data that we wanted to show, this set of data has a 20-year period of record. So it's going to show the change in water level from the year 2000 to the year 2020. And this is when comparing these types of data, you really do want to have the same period of record so that what you're looking at is apples to apples. And you also want to make sure that the wells that you're using for that comparison are not pumping wells, are indicative of the aquifer, are placed right. And so there's a table in that report, table 6, which is the one that we use to generate the following plots. And that table is the groundwater level change statistics and counts of wells with declines, rises, or no water level change in Arizona by sub-basin from 2000 to 2020. So it's important to know this is a subset of that previous slide. But this subset is highly controlled. We know exactly, what the data is, and it's valid data. Next, please. So here is how we will be presenting the data to you. Box and whisker plots are a statistical plot. And click one more time for me. We have one of these plots for each basin, and we're going to show them to you guys with maps coming up. And we group them into smaller groups because if you were to look at all 50 basins on a single plot, you wouldn't be able to tell what you're looking at. So we do have them broken out by geographies. And I brought my own laser pointer. That's the scientist in me. When looking at a box and whisker plot, the thing to know is if you took all of the data and you lined it up from smallest to largest, a box and whisker plot will separate it into quartiles. And so we're looking at, it's not the average. The average is listed here as well, but what we're looking at is there a lot of data that's skewed towards declines, for example, or skewed towards rises? And a way to visualize that quickly without having to look at hundreds and hundreds of data points in a table is to look at one of these plots, and this upper section here, that is the skinny line with the top bound here, that is the upper quartile. So that is, if you took all those data points and lined them up, the top 25%, the upper quartile of the data would be in that range. This filled in box here is called the inner quartile range, and that is the second and third quartile together. And then the lower one here, this is the bottom quartile, the minimum. So when you look at a plot like this and you see if it's spread out real large like this, then you know that the data is kind of spread. If it's compressed and real flat, then you know all the data is essentially around the same value. So you don't have as much spread in the data. This line here that we'll see in the middle of the boxes, that is where the 50th percentile cutoff is. So that means we lined up all the data and cut it right in half. Half would be above, half would be below. But every single one of those will also have a little X in the box too. And that is the actual average of the values of all the data. So we have mean and averages both represented. Click. But then there are also these things called outliers when looking at data sets statistically. If you have a single point or some points that are more than 1.5 times the interquartile range above or below the minimum or maximum, we consider that a statistical outlier data point. So that could, and we still show them and represent them, but they're not used in the box plot. All right, so let's get into it. Next one. This is a map of our active management areas. And also of note, anywhere on these maps where you see these red polygons or splotches, those are areas where we have known mapped land subsidence. And land subsidence is a result of dewatering fine grain units and compression of those units. So if you have land subsidence, you've already experienced a significant amount of water level decline. It is very significant. Anyway, the AMAs here, you can see we have Phoenix, Pinal, Prescott, Santa Cruz, Tucson, and Douglas. Douglas is the new AMA, so luckily we do have a period of record for Douglas because of it being an INA previously. The other thing of note, if you look at these plots, you'll see an N value. N is the number count. So that's how many data points are in each of these box and whisker plots. So we have 160 wells that we use that had the same 20-year period of record and had clean index well data. And this is the representation of the water levels during that 20-year period. So we have, this is the lower quartile, so 25% of them are experiencing 0 to about -52 or so of decline. This is 50% of the data, right? And remember, the boxes is the interquartile range, so majority of it is right around here. We do have some outliers that show a lot of rise, and those would likely be from recharge facilities nearby to injection sites and things like that. Similar trends for Pinal. Prescott AMA is below the red dashed line. That red dashed line is the 0 line. So if there was no change at all in the water level over 20 years, that would be right on that plot, around that point. Tucson is straddling the 0 line, has some outliers above and below, and Douglas is entirely below the 0 line. Any questions on this slide before we move to the rural basins? Yeah. You want to hit your button? Sorry.
Okay, my button, sorry. Ryan, just to clarify, the N is the amount of data,
The number.
not the number of wells.
No, it's the number. It's the number of wells because we're doing before and after, right? So the change is what we're plotting. So this is the water level change over 20 years. So each well could have a whole bunch of data points, but we're looking to see what is it at the end versus the beginning.
So it is the number of wells then that we're
It is
getting the data from.
It is the number of wells that are used to plot these box and whiskers.
Thank you.
And as I said at the beginning, like we have way more wells in our index line, but these are the ones that were highly controlled and had clean data, right? And it's also publicly available data. It's published. Everything here can be replicated by anyone. So that OFR report has all of these data points. All right, next slide. Here you see the Central Highlands area, and at first glance you say it looks pretty compressed, but in reality I have all of these plots on the same vertical scale. And the reason why is we want you guys to be able to compare them from slide to slide and see what the apples to apples comparison is on rises or declines. Central Highlands looks like they're sitting pretty close to the 0 line, but you can see the significantly lower number of data points. So this is where we get into the discussion of getting additional data in rural areas. In the AMAs, we have quite a lot, and in the rural basins, we don't have as much. Next slide. Eastern Plateau is considered a single basin, so we have just this one box and whisker plot. It is a bedrock aquifer, so it's very different than the rest of these, but for completeness sake, we still included this slide. Next, please. So lower Colorado River, here we have Butler Valley, Gila Bend, Harquahela, Lower Gila, McMullen, Parker, Renegris, and Yuma. Also, as I said before, the red sections here are mapped land subsidence features that we've already measured and recorded. But in general, you can see how, because this is a utilized area for agriculture, there's the majority of these basins are all below the 0 line with the majority of their data. And the Gila Bend box and whisker plot is pretty extreme. Next slide. Here we're looking at southeastern Arizona. So Aravaipa, I won't read all of them, but down in the southeastern corner of the state, minus Douglas, because Douglas is now an AMA, so it's not on this plot. But you can also see that there's some declining happening in Aravaipa, but there's only a couple of water level data points that fit the criteria for this analysis. So we would want to look closer at that before drawing conclusions. But here in Wilcox, for example, we've got 26 different data points that have that continuous record of 20 years, and it's showing a fair amount of decline as well. All right, next. Upper Colorado River. So here in the western side of the state, pretty flat, a little bit of rise, a little bit of fall, but once again, look at the sample size. So anything that has an N value that's 1, 2, or 3 is good to know, but I wouldn't use it for decision making. You'd want to collect more data first. All right, next. Western Plateau. So Coconino, Grand Wash, Kanab, and Virgin River, sorry. And it's pretty stable or flat as well, but check out the count. And next. On this slide, we looked at 3 of the basins that we were previously looking at as well in the previous slides, but we put these 3 together because they show a significant amount of decline over this 20-year period of record. They show nothing but decline, really. None of those wells had any rising data in that 20-year period. And we also have mapped land subsidence features. So these are what we are calling priority or severe decline basins. Any questions on this slide before we move on?
Just one quick question.
Yeah.
So when we looked back earlier and we saw McMullen Valley along with Renegris Plain, what makes this worse than McMullen Valley? Because they both looked to be in about the same spot, maybe McMullen Valley worse.
So here, look at McMullen. So it has the maximum value here is down to about negative, or 80-foot decline, similar to Renegris, but it does show areas of rise, and it's in a similar boat.
Folks online cannot see your laser pointer.
I know.
So, okay.
That's a benefit for the folks that showed up in person. Otherwise I would be directing you verbally. Look at the bottom corner. But no, they're very similar in decline. But those basins have, transportation status or issues, and so they have a different, lens to look through when evaluating them.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
And Matt Bear, question for you on the data, because I was clicking on AWR's website after last meeting, and I have that table you mentioned, and specifically, like, just my own curiosity, Gila Bend Basin, like, pretty big flooding event 2021. Obviously 2023 was like a lake down there. If I went to that website, is the data live? And can I compare historical information? Because I was struggling to gather that.
To see live data like currently, or
Most recent recording.
yeah, if you go to that GWSI website, the link that was on the previous slides, you'll see an interactive web map with all the dots. If you click on it, it'll say, here's the well's name, ID, registration. It doesn't show you anything yet. It just gives you like the basics of it, the stats. If you click on the hydrograph button, it'll pop open the entire period of record that we have, all the data points we've collected from that well going back to even the 40s. So you'll see a plot that shows the water level over time, so a hydrograph plot. But it is an extra click. After you click the well, there's a hydrograph link that you click that one and it shows it to you. If the well has a transducer in it, on the top of the plot, you'll be able to toggle between the hand measurements versus the transducer recorded measurements. So you can see, make sure that the transducer is reading accurately, or, it's just a way of qualifying the data.
Thank you.
Ryan.
Yeah.
Also, how would you find the location of that well, especially based on that question, the location of the well in relation to the river?
Where it plots.
Yep.
The web map is interactive, but also the GWSI ID number is its latitude and longitude. So the registration number, not the 55, but the GWSI number is its location number. It's actually where you can find it. So we kind of wanted to make sure people don't look at cadastrals, that they can actually zoom in right to the well itself. So GWSI wells that have that number or that ID will have been surveyed, and that location will be accurate. Whereas on the Wells 55 database, some of those are still in cadastral, and they could be quarter, and off by 10 acres, right? So the GWSI is, if you're looking for more representative, accurate location data and water level data, that's the data set I would use. But you can see on the map too, where's the floodplain, where's the river, how far away, you can see exactly where it is. And you can turn on like imagery versus a topography map, so you can see buildings and see streets, and kind of, you can locate yourself pretty easily.
Ryan, this is Sharon McDowell. May I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if for a future map, I really appreciate the way you've laid this out. I wasn't at the last meeting, and it's very helpful to do it by those regions. But I wonder if you could prepare a similar map that showed us the basins that are open for groundwater transportation and just the information, across those limited number of basins. I think that could be interesting to take a look at.
Yeah, I mean, they're all in this presentation as well, just for the water level over that period of time. But I keep saying, this is an apples to apples comparison because it's a statistical analysis. So we want to make sure that we're consistent in how each of these plots are graphed. But if you want to really dig into those transportation basins, you can go to that interactive web map and you can start looking at all the water levels over time for all of the wells. You can kind of explore, right?
Yeah, but Ryan, my request or suggestion is simpler than that. I'm just saying if you could prepare a similar slide where you put those 4 or 5 basins on the same slide so we can look at like the Renegris Basin, Plain Basin. I think that maybe some of it is open for transportation. I'm just saying that would be interesting to take a look at.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, no additional data, just plotting a slightly different grouping. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. Okay.
Ryan, this is Councilmember Springer. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear me or not. Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
I assume you'll know the question I'm going to ask. There's some other groundwater data other than wells, which might be valuable to include to describe trends and conditions. And those would be either base flow trends from stream gauging stations or discharge from springs that have long-term records. So that may be worth us having a separate side conversation about that after this meeting today.
Yeah, agreed. They are interrelated, right? So water level will respond to spring discharges and base flows and underflows. So it's a whole hydrologic system. But Nicole's been waiting, so hold on.
I was just going to point out that several of the transportation basins are already incorporated on the lower Colorado River region slide, which is slide 19. Butler Valley, Harquahala, McMullen Valley, and I think the Yuma Basin are all transportation basins. And then the other one would be the Big Chino.
Yeah, Nicole, this is Sharon again. I appreciate that, but we also have the Harquahala is a transportation basin, right? And anyway, just you may know where they all are and you can very quickly make the mental note of them, but I'm just saying not all of us have that at our fingertips. And anyway, I would find it interesting, but if nobody else would, I'm not going to ask staff to do additional work. It's just, I would actually I think it would be helpful for us to be reminded on a map, which are the transportation basins.
That is an easy request to fill, so I'd be happy to generate a map that highlights the transportation basins and labels them so that you know which ones are which. Yes.
So could you go back to the map with I can't remember what you called it, but this is basically the upper northwest part of the state where the Kanab, the next one up. Yep. So like on that one, when there's so few wells there, or at least is that, so like for this particular area, you said that you're only reporting the wells where you had the most control, where they're comparable. So in this particular area, is that also the case, or is there only 3 wells in the Virgin River Basin?
No, this is that subset. So this is the smaller selection of our complete index line. So 1,714 wells we have, but total across the state. But here, these are only the ones that were in the OFR 20 report, where we had that 20-year period of record, because we want, when looking at data like this, especially when visualizing it, needs to be the same scale, needs to be apples to apples, needs to be the same time period. Everything needs to be exactly the same. So the only thing that's different is the trend or the spread. And that's why we, took a 20-year data set and we're taking that exact same set for each of these basins. Can you go back to the index map site, the first one, Trent? keep going. And one more. There we go. This is the distribution of our index wells. So we do not have a whole bunch up there, but we do have more than one or two. Kind of hard to tell at this scale, but some of those things that look like single dots could be a cluster of dots. But this is the map where, you know, my call to action to everyone here would be to let us collect more data to help fill this out. Thanks, Trent. Yeah.
Grant Hanna. So we're here in Phoenix looking at this data I know we have the website that's available, but to what extent have we disseminated that data to the water users and landowners in those basins? And does the department have strategies for getting the data?
Like educational outreach? Mm-hmm. I mean, we do hold public meetings across the whole state, and we do typically try to have a data component first, and here's where you find it component. But yeah, I mean, we can always do more. Education is critical, in my opinion. Yeah.
Being from the Northwest region, I think it's also not just on ADWR, but it's on the counties and the cities to partner with ADWR to get that message out.
Yeah, and there are other folks who take this exact same data and then put it into a different web map and present it too. So those are everywhere as well. But this is the original source. Yeah.
And Grant, I guess I would add that in those priority basins, I don't think it's going to be any surprise to those that are in those basins on this information that we're sharing. But yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
And then I have one last slide. So Trent, if you want to go there. When looking at basins to figure out, you know, hey, do we have a groundwater depletion problem? You do look at water level declines and you look at land subsidence, which we were just shown, but you also do look at water quality. We don't monitor and regulate water quality, that's DEQ. But there is available data, so I wanted to make sure everyone in this room and anyone else who listens to this later can see the link to go to DEQ's groundwater basin fact sheet site. They have basin by basin groundwater quality studies that they've done, including all of the rural basins. So when looking at the three severe decline basins, essentially we just check to see which primary or secondary drinking water standards does that basin show exceedances with. That doesn't mean every single well will have the same chemistry, but what we're showing here is that these basins themselves do have water quality constituents of concern, and a lot, if not all of them, are typically in these basins naturally occurring. So one other thing that we discussed previously, and to get ahead of the questions, arsenic is naturally occurring. It precipitates out of granite. A lot of these heavy metals come out of the natural native formation. As water passes through, it dissolves it out. Anywhere we have caliche, we have a lot of high TDS. Uranium is natural. A lot of this stuff comes out of the rocks themselves. So no need to panic. There's no like nuclear spills happening here. And that is all of my slides.
Thank you, Ryan. Oh, Tom.
So Ryan, I'm curious. So a lot of data presented on declines in groundwater level. Has any modeling been done to link the amount of decline to the actual volume of water that has been withdrawn, maybe especially in those priority basins?
So that groundwater models are very complicated and they're very hard to develop. They take several years just to make one. And so we don't have basins or models for every single basin. We do have one for Wilcox, but we do not have one for Gila Bend or Renegris. Developing additional groundwater flow models would be great because they're a fantastic tool, but it is like a labor level of effort concern. That's a lot of manpower. But any of the areas where we do have models, we look at the entire hydrologic system. So it's not just what are the water levels doing declining. We'll look at things like river flows and base flows, and we'll look at precipitation, and we'll look at historical pumping. But in Phoenix and in Pinal and in the areas where we have a long history of regulation, we've got tons of information. But in these rural basins, the vast majority of them, I mean, look at the number count for this statistical analysis. We don't have a lot of data. We don't really know what people are pumping. They don't have to report it, and so they don't. If we knew exactly what everyone was withdrawing, then we could put that into a model and generate one, and it would be hopefully as accurate as you can get. But right now, if we were to pick a very secluded basin and say make a model, we'd have to make a bunch of assumptions because we don't know what people are actually pumping. We'll have water level data, but you don't want to calibrate just a single value. You want to use as many different calibration points as you can. It's a way of stressing your model to make sure it's accurate, right? But yeah, there would be some data gaps if we were to generate models in some of these more rural basins.
Ryan, not to put you on the spot, but can you, off the top of your head, list all the places we do have models?
Yes, all the AMAs. So Phoenix, Pinal, Tucson, Santa Cruz, Prescott. And then we have one for Wilcox. We have Harquahela. Emily, what am I missing?
The USGS.
Oh, yeah. The USGS one is the Northwest Basin. So theirs has Wallapai plus, because we took their Wallapai section and then did our own analysis with it. But theirs also, I think, included Sacramento Valley. Right. That one was ours. Okay. So we do have some areas where basins were developed, but out of 51, that's not very many of them. Oh yeah, and San Pedro. We are currently working on Douglas because it was voted in as an AMA. One of the requirements is to follow the Assured Water Supply Program. And one of the ways to show physical availability is to use a groundwater flow model. But we're probably, 3 years out before that model will be complete. But it is one of our top priorities in the modeling section is to get that model done. Yeah.
Ryan, can you talk about how last year the legislature required the department to do supply and demand studies of the 46 basins over the next 5 years, or appropriated funds for that? How does that fit into the available data that the department will have?
I mean, I can give my answer, or the person running the program can.
My name's Natalie Mast. I'm the Active Management Areas Director at ADWR. So we do have a team that is working on supply and demand analyses. The requirement in statute is that we conduct an analysis of each groundwater basin at least once every 5 years. So the basins that we're working on for this year are, let's see if I can list these all off the top of my head. Harquahela, McMullen, Butler, Tiger Wash, Douglas, Wilcox, and San Bernardino. So we're required to do a minimum of 6 each year. We're doing 7 this year. And to get to all 51, we'll have to average a higher number. But we do have some flexibility there. Those reports are due December 1st of each year, starting this upcoming December. So we are working toward actually writing those reports and completing our analysis for the 2023 calendar year.
I think it's important to note too that those analyses are not the same as a groundwater flow model.
Correct,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And I think that's a really important point. So the style of that analysis is really a water budget. We're looking at water demands, water supplies, do those two things match up, projecting those things out into the future. So it's really a paper mathematical exercise rather than something geographic or geospatial.
Can you repeat the list?
Hopefully I don't miss any this time. Let's see. Harquahela, Butler, McMullen, Tiger Wash, Wilcox, Douglas, and San Bernardino.
Yes.
So with those analysis that you're doing, like what's an example of the type of data that you're using to do that?
Sure, that's a good question. So we are using a very wide combination of things. So we do have some water use estimates outside the active management areas from the USGS. So we're using some information there. We're also looking at the types of demands that exist in those areas and seeing if we can create any water use estimates by looking at number of acres and crop types, or looking at estimated water uses associated with things like grazing or industrial uses. So we're really doing an extensive estimate exercise on those water uses outside the AMAs, and also on supplies, using some of the information we do have in those areas related to water levels and that type of thing to create estimates related to the volume of water that is underground. Would you add anything to that?
No, I would just add that in some of those basins, we have really good information on what the recharge is, what the precipitation is, what the infiltration is. Some areas we have great data. In some areas that haven't been studied previously by USGS or others, we don't have as much historical data to look back to. So I believe in each of the sections, when the reports do come out, the data will be all explained where it came from, where all of it will be cited properly, but it'll also show, give you a sense of, okay, here we have a robust set of historical data, but maybe in this basin we don't because it's so small or there's no one there. San Bernardino is pretty small and there's not a lot of information there, and same for Tiger Wash too. And so we have anything that we can find either from ourselves, EZGS, or USGS, and any of the university studies. We cast a wide net for data on those analyses.
Thank you.
I'll keep going, Bruce, but no.
Thank you, Ryan. Any other questions? We'll go ahead and move on. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Natalie. Now what we'll do is we'll move to discussing some of the proposed concepts. And as I mentioned earlier, these were really whittled down based off of input from you all, review by the committee, subcommittee, and also review by DWR. Next slide, please. And first, what we'll touch upon is the framework for managing rural groundwater. That framework that we're focusing in on is the LGSA type concept. Next slide, please. The LGSA, or for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's the local groundwater stewardship area, and there was a piece of legislation that was recently proposed and has been under development for quite some time. Many of you around this table have been actively involved in that legislation, and so I thought what I would do is just very briefly go through, why the LGSA and why are we looking at LGSA as a recommended approach to the governor to these basins that are in significant need. And I think you all, it was very obvious that there are 3 basins that need immediate attention, and that where this LGSA potentially could apply. But why LGSA? Past input on concept design has come from a wide variety of not only you all, but also rural stakeholders, water users, and other officials. We had talked about the objective of this organization and the council, and this flexible approach to accommodate the local situational issues and the unique characteristics of each basin is very, very important when it comes to the objectives. Also, local water user oversight and input in the planning and involvement with this concept. There's also the oversight, and many of you have very much supported the need to have ADWR actively involved from a management approval and support perspective. And then this also provides the opportunity, as I mentioned, to focus on the priority basins. Those priority basins where overpumping is occurring today. There are declines in aquifer levels. There are physical signs of distress, whether that's us getting phone calls regarding wells going dry or evidence of subsidence. And then this also provides us an alternative flexible approach to creating an AMA or an INA, and it very much focuses upon managing the aquifer based off of local needs and the unique characteristics of that aquifer. And there are many more details within each of these that will need to be discussed as we move forward. So if I could, I'd like to go to the next slide. And this is really a high-level review of key components associated with the LGSA. We essentially took information from the legislation itself, and there was some information that had been reviewed at a high level on certain components of the LGSA. So what I thought I would do here is just kind of review those key components and those high-level components, and then also include where there's been some revisions or suggested revisions from the department on those high-level areas and those key components. So this first area is the designation. The designation of an LGSA, fairly simple, but the designation process could be initiated by DWR. Now, there are criteria associated with that we're going to have to go into a lot more detail to discuss as a committee. But it can be initiated by DWR, local voters, or the County Board of Supervisors through a resolution. And we've shared some of that information with you in past meetings. ADWR considers the designation criteria, holds public meetings, and issues an order to designate the area as an LGSA. And then lastly, the LGSA boundary is by groundwater basin with potentially some exceptions for northern Arizona that we've talked about that we're going to have a bit more discussion on. So from a designation perspective, you can kind of get an understanding of what we're talking about associated with the LGSA. The LGSA, an important component of this is that you're going to have involvement by local water users. So there's an appointment and a formation of LGSA council. The original LGSA or the existing legislation suggested 9 members. We're suggesting 5 members. And part of that has to do with, we think it might be difficult to find 9 members within some of these basins that have the background and the understanding and as a water user to be on the council. So our suggestion was 5 members appointed by the governor. And again, this is DWR's suggestions. I know that we're going to have some discussion on this. 4 of the 5 must reside within the LGSA with at least 3 chosen from lists submitted by the counties, cities, and towns within the boundaries of the LGSA. 1 represents agricultural water users, 1 represents industrial water users, 1 represents municipal or residential water users, and 2 at-large members who reside within the LGSA. And then, of course, all are selected based on their knowledge, experience, and ability to represent stakeholders through transparent application process. So I'll stop there and see if there are any thoughts from committee members. Yes, Ron.
Ron Dova from NAMWAT. Bruce, I think the key word in my mind when we look at the designation is initiated in that first sentence, because I've heard a lot of comments over the years about who has the qualifications and the expertise and the knowledge to actually make this decision about should an LGSA be formed or not. And that's just how the process is initiated. It's not the final say on whether, the information that's been presented is valid and if it's warranted to even make that LGSA there. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Yes.
If I could, regarding the council, when you're saying 1 agricultural water user, would a rancher also qualify under that designation as well?
Yes, I would think so.
Okay.
Yes. And maybe what we need to do is define that in a little bit more detail, but yes.
Yeah. And then when you talk about represents municipal or residential water users, would that be a commercial home builder, or would that be, in your mind, a municipality? And the reason I ask is I think being from a rural county, Mojave County being the 5th largest geographically, we have a few incorporated cities, but we have a whole lot of people that are outside of those municipal water systems. And we have a lot of people on wells.
Right.
You look at who's represented, they're all representing a certain interest, and it's really only a city or a county that has the duty to look out for the public health, safety, and welfare of everybody in the basin. So hopefully they would be represented. Hopefully, also, they're the ones typically that are in charge of doing the 10-year general plans. They're in charge of doing any sort of water plans. They're in charge of applying for most of the grants in rural for water infrastructure, recharge projects, things like this. So hopefully they would be able to be on that committee as well.
You know, Travis, I would suggest that you provide us some of your thoughts on how we define each one of these so that it covers some of those issues associated with each of these basins. Because I want to make sure it's comprehensive enough so that it's easily understood, or I know we do.
Bruce, this is Sharon. Could I ask a question, please?
Yes. Hi, Sharon.
Hi. So before you explain why you went to the number 5, I thought you might have indicated that this is comparable with the size of groundwater user advisory councils and for the AMAs. But I wonder, for those of us who, I've looked at the LGSA legislation, but I'm not as familiar with it as some others. What role does the council play? Is it advisory or is it actually a definitive decision-making?
Sharon, that's part of the discussion that we're going to have as we go through the LGSA. But if you look at the legislation, and that'll be one of the other components that we'll touch upon a bit on this next slide. So
okay, so I'll let you go. I'll let you go. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Paul.
I just was curious. So it shows one agricultural member, and agriculture is going to be one of the largest impacts probably. Are the 2 at-large members excluded from being those other categories that are listed?
No.
Okay. And then the other concern is if most of them are appointed by municipalities, that may skew the power of municipalities versus agriculture.
Okay. Karen.
And I would also suggest, as you're thinking about municipal or residential water users, public water systems that are regulated by DEQ via the Safe Drinking Water Act,
right,
I think need to be in that mix. Okay. Cities and counties, or cities sometimes are the public water system, but they're not always.
So last planning commission meeting, we had a lady on Teams.
Brief comment, if I could. Each of the regions that you showed, if you were to look at their general plan, their economic development strategic plan, you do have some regions that are not historically agricultural intense. It doesn't reflect their economy. Right. They were never meant to be agriculturally intense. Right. And I would hope that the committee for that, it goes back to how an LGSA is flexible.
Right. Thank you. Yes, Grant.
I have one question and a follow-up. So in the plan that was shown at the last subcommittee meeting, I believe it was 3 governor appointments and then 2 made by the County Board of Supervisors. Has that changed between that last meeting and today?
Can you answer that?
Yeah, we did propose a change in that just because there were concerns about the number of counties that might be covered within certain groundwater basins. And I think Sharon had asked about or tried to ask about the number of members, and we reduced it from 9 to 5 because I think there are some basins that may be small enough where you wouldn't necessarily have 9 members that would be available to participate and have a quorum often enough. So we reduced it to 5 members. And then with only 2 at-large members, it's possible that you might be in a situation where the counties could never agree on 2 members. If you have 4 or 5 counties that have to agree, depending on the basin, then they may not be able to select 2. So instead, we decided to have a list that would be submitted by local elected officials that could be kind of the basis for selection in order to make sure that you get representation across the basin. That's just a proposal, though, and obviously it's appropriate for the committee or subcommittee to discuss that further.
Okay. So I have the duty today to represent Senator Kerr without her intimate firsthand experience and her poise, which I don't think anybody can replicate. I think if she were here, the senator would comment that there's a dissonance between its the title as a local groundwater management structure and its initiation and governance structure. Under Senator Kerr's proposal, it would be initiated through consent of the governed. It would include the actual groundwater users in a petition and an election. And it would require, as the legislature has made a priority prior to initiating regulation, look at the consequences for the local communities of, the jobs and businesses in those communities, and then statewide, what are the effects of, the diminished access to minerals or food security, rising prices that go along with that. Under this model, you would have the ability to initiate it in Phoenix. You would have all of the appointments made in Phoenix for regions hundreds of miles away without those considerations at the outset. I think my questions are, and again, under Senator Kerr's proposal, there would be an economic analysis similar to rulemaking, which has anti-competitive effects for the probable costs and benefits to businesses directly affected, the administrative and other costs required for compliance, and the probable cost and benefit to private persons and consumers who are directly affected. Under this proposal, my follow-up questions is, it appears that even if the Board of Supervisors was opposed to the formation, the director could still form the LGSA. And then two, what recourse do the members of that community have to hold accountable the entity that is proposing changes if all the appointments are made by the governor? Typically with an elected body, you have the ability to go to the ballot and change your leadership. So those are my two questions.
In regard to the director, at this point, yes, the director would have the authority potentially to establish an LGSA based off of conditions. And we've listed a certain set of criteria. That's something that's up for discussion. In regard to the other question, I would suggest that that's another item that would need to be up for discussion for this group when it comes to the designation of an LGSA.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. I don't think anything is set in stone at this time. I think we're certainly willing to discuss the basis for the initiation, and then also whether who nominates or forms the council. I would say that having an election might be cumbersome for this process, though. That would just be my one point of input, but that's still a policy decision, obviously.
So also, Grant, I think we're trying to find tools different than the AMAs or INAs in which the director can create those, and in those processes, there's certainly due process embedded in the hearings and in people's ability to object to the outcome. So again, trying to find something different than those processes, but maybe we can look at those processes in terms of the due process and how that might apply here for the decision of the director or the creation of these LGSAs.
Thank you. And I think the Senator looks forward to that discussion. What we're talking about is decoupling a process right now, like an INA, that can be initiated by the director with a governing body. And I think we'll get into it with the powers of this entity that has significantly more powers beyond preserving an INA. You preserve your existing investment. If there's mandatory reduction requirements, that actually can go to taking away people's ability to earn a living. And so the balancing of, not having an election with how much power this entity could have.
Thank you, Grant.
Senator Kerr submitted that proposal. It's contained in the documents distributed by the department.
So no.
As part of her role, as part of the charge of the committee, Senator Kerr crafted a proposal that I'm speaking to.
Thank you. Stephanie.
So I think when looking at this in a little more detail than it was presented before, a lot of the issues and concerns that were included in the LGSA were based on a balance between local control, the role of DWR. And looking at this to me moves farther away in the opposite direction of what those concerns were. In other words, the council is getting smaller. It's the appointments are by the governor, even though there is the caveat of the 3 chosen lists submitted by county, cities, and towns. It's still the fact that the governor is making that final decision about those folks. So that would be one, just for the purposes of feedback and comment on this particular presentation. I think this takes this largely out of the hands of local decision-making. It's going in the wrong direction in terms of size. I think if there's areas where you would have a difficult time getting enough folks, then the purpose of this tool is to be flexible. And that can be certainly something that can be compensated for. But to overly restrict the number from the beginning, I think is a bad idea. And I also think that the degree of impact of any type of planning tool is largely going to fall on industry and agriculture, which are very much underrepresented with this format. So I think that whatever the format is, it should be comparable to what the burden and the impact, whether that's economically or whatever, has for that particular region.
Thank you. Chris.
Sure, yeah. So wanted to go back to Grant's comments, and thanks for those, Grant. So on the designation process with the 3 paths, so 1, the director himself, local voters, or county board of supervisors, those paths are pretty similar to what there was about 2 dozen rural community leaders that got together the summer of 2022 that started working on this LGSA proposal. And it might be helpful to just to acknowledge the reason for, at least in the minds of that group, the reason for the DWR initiation path was that the director currently has the authority to designate AMAs and INAs. And so keeping in mind, one of the principles for putting together this proposal was to provide a viable, achievable alternative to AMAs and INAs. And so if it came to a scenario where the director was considering AMAs and INAs, the rural communities would, and at least to put that together, wanted the director to have the option to be able to do an LGSA. So that was the reason behind that. And then same with the local voters, like that 10% also matches what it would take to initiate an INA. So it was looking at what currently exists and then trying to match that in the designation process.
Thank you. Sandy.
On the list, can I just make one recommendation to the group would be to add the local legislators to that, to kind of balance out the city-town thing.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Something to throw out there.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Just one other minor comment that I forgot to mention before. With the 1 agricultural water user, just a reminder that there's a drastic difference between the water use on a ranch and the water use on a farm. And even if you were in a basin where it was mostly acreage-wise ranching and you had a few farms, there's still going to be a drastic difference between the impact of some kind of action.
Sandy.
So I'm assuming that we are following the existing definitions, exempt, non-exempt, and hold on just a second, industrial would include dairies and feedlots.
Yes.
As well, correct?
Yes, those are, yes. Senator Travers.
Sandy, when you say local legislators, you me? Yeah, no, I don't think that would be a really good idea. Local needs to be local because our job we're already at the state level doing that in theory.
Thanks, Representative Travers.
Just to clarify, you were suggesting that local legislators would be able to nominate, to provide a list?
Not on the board. No, absolutely not. That's not what I meant. I meant put the list together. Thanks, Nicole, for clarifying that. I was whining because she wasn't listening to me.
Thank you.
I was all in my head.
As you can see, there's a lot of detail that we still need to work through on this, and I appreciate everybody's comments on this.
Even then, I don't know that's a good idea. Like Congress has when they nominate those blue lists and things, and stuff always gets kind of convoluted. We want to try to keep this as pure as. We're having lunch soon, so we'll talk about this, Sandy.
Trent, just one last comment, if I could. Being from Mojave County, listening to some of the suggestions, it would be our hope, and the other counties that we work with. I mean, we have a very strong partnership with between Mojave, Coconino, Yavapai, La Paz, and some of the others that Chris mentioned. We would hope that the final process wouldn't be any more onerous than it is for an AMA or an INA, because that kind of defeats the purpose.
Right. Thank you.
I have one more.
Yes.
So I think to Chris's point, one of the things I think we're going to discuss is like the requisite conditions for initiating the designation, and I
yes,
think that warrants the discussion about a different, or does the existing initiation process work, because you're expanding significantly the initiating conditions and the powers of the board through an INA. So I think those are available models, but both the requisite conditions that have to exist and the powers make it worthwhile to explore something that's different than an INA.
Okay. Any other comments? We could go to the next slide, and this slide looked great on paper. It doesn't look so good, and I apologize for that. Management plan development and approval. The LGSA Council develops a management plan that defines goals for management, identifies proposed management actions from a menu of options and relevant implementing entities, and lays out a monitoring program to report on progress toward the goals, coordinates with other state agencies, municipal corporations, special districts, public authorities, subdivisions of state, and private entities, Indian tribes, agencies of the U.S. government, and submits the plan to the director for approval. Now, there's a lot of detail behind all this that we're going to have to discuss, but at a higher level, I just wanted to go through some of these key concepts and on management plan development and approval and what this council would be doing. Next is implementation, and hopefully I can read that, but are there any questions? Move on to implementation. The LGSA Council submits recommendations and requests to the director to implement the management actions included in the plan. Relevant entities consider and approve, if appropriate, the management actions, and then relevant entities in coordination with ADWR implement and enforce the actions. So that could be potentially a city with conservation mandates as an example. But again, there's a lot of detail behind this that we're going to have to discuss as a committee. And then periodic plan review. Every 10 years, the director reviews conditions and determines whether to modify or rescind the LGSA designation. If LGSA is extended by the director, management plan is reviewed and council recommends to readopt the existing plan or recommends a new management plan. I'll stop there and see if there are any questions or comments to these three elements. Haley.
Thanks for getting my name right.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to maybe reemphasize or clarify that in the implementation,
it is the council itself is not implementing or enforcing anything. They're simply recommending, and DWR is approving that what they've put forth will meet their goal. But in terms of the implementation, it's going to be relying on DWR, counties, cities, whatever from the menu of options they chose. Just wanted to kind of clarify that, or if you could expand on that.
Thank you, Haley. And actually, we'll have a couple of slides after this that'll touch upon that, so we can have that discussion, but thank you for that.
Bruce, this is Sharon, just with a question, and maybe you're going to come to this. I'm going to have to personally think about this rescinding the LGSA designation. And I do want to ask, are there provisions about rescinding INA designation? I don't recall there's about AMA designation. So I just want to note that that piqued my interest.
No, there are no provisions currently to rescind either an INA or AMA designation.
Did that answer your question, Sharon?
Yeah, I think this is something to be discussed as we go along this process.
Agreed.
Because if we're not actually even clear what leads to the LGSA designation, I see this as very different. I think the 10 years comes up in various things, the CAGRD plan of operation, various designations of assured water supply, and so forth, periodically coming up, other permits. I'm just not sure if that this is consistent with the thrust of having a local area stewardship, a local area designated for some special attention. Yes, conditions may change, but that doesn't mean, we don't know what the criteria are for this. So like I said, it piqued my interest, and it's something I think that we'll need to, I'll want to see some additional discussion of.
Okay. Yes, Nicole.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too that one of the other points involves modifying the designation. So there could be some elements or some of the purposes of making the designation initially could have been achieved and could be removed so that the plan doesn't necessarily need to incorporate certain elements to address something that's been resolved. At the same time, there could be other new issues that have arisen that should be incorporated in the plan. So.
Yeah, Nicole, thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Stephanie.
So on the implementation portion of it, so what if the director doesn't like any of the recommendations of the council?
That would never happen, Stephanie. So I think what that implementation box really gets to is there can be some back and forth between the council and what really will come about in the plan. And hopefully that process allows that input for the director to come to a common understanding and as much agreement as possible on where the plan's going to go. I guess in the worst case scenario, just to be honest, since the director can initiate, the director could use that path. If there is really that much difference where the director doesn't feel like the director wants to take the management plan that's brought forward to him, the director could initiate the process on his own and create a plan. Is that not what can happen under this concept?
Yeah, I think we've been talking about it more from the standpoint of the director could would review the plan and most likely would at least have one round of suggesting revisions to the plan or commenting on it and giving the council the opportunity to make modifications accordingly and, ideally reach resolution that way. I would say that one of the key issues that we're concerned about is the director being in a position of being required to implement a plan that the director doesn't have the authority to implement. You know, if there's a council that says, we want you to shut down all the farms, ADWR does not have the authority to do that. We're not under any circumstances going to approve a plan that tells us to do that or to shut down uses of any type, not just farms, but that's not what ADWR can or should do. If there are, you know, I mean, we have to abide by the federal and state constitution, by the laws of the state. So we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to avoid putting ADWR in a situation where we have liability for not implementing the plan when we know we can't, or for implementing the plan because it's not legal. So that is a big part of what we're looking for. I think that obviously, the director may also have additional feedback along the lines of, we don't think that this particular tool would be very effective, or we think it might be, you know, too cumbersome for the water users given the likely results of it. We've tried that before and it didn't really work out very well. You know, there might be a lot of that type of feedback that the director may be able to provide as well on, you know, the substantive proposals, but in the end, we want to be able to avoid being in a position of being required to implement something that we don't think we're legally able to do.
Representative Travers.
Thank you. So I have a hypothetical. If we have an area that meets all the criteria of a designated AMA, but don't want to go that route and would prefer to talk with all the local entities to try to implement various components of the LGSA before we go to DEFCON 4. This would allow us, I'm assuming that in the management plan process, if they have any questions or if they need any manpower to get to their data collection, they could rely on you guys.
The thought is, as we've discussed this, is that there will be significant involvement by DWR in coordinating, working together with the council.
So before we get to implementation, you guys are already in conversations with them on how to best facilitate this.
Right.
And given all the latitude of the LGSA in picking and choosing, it seems to me it's best practice to refer to the local government and to the local entities to try to come up with their own problem solving before somebody else solves the problem for them. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Sandy.
And I know this is just a very high level sort of overview of this, and we need to discuss details, but under implementation, under the second and third bullet points, the terms relevant entities makes me way nervous. I would hope that we will define that a whole lot more, like who is that?
Yeah.
Is it DWR? Is it, you know?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes.
Let's be on the record.
Paul.
Sharon brought up rescinding, and so I wanted to make a few comments on that. I think where we're getting to, we talked some, not today so much, but is designating these in the high priority, high needs areas. So to me, there would be some trigger that said this groundwater basin is a place that we want to apply some kind of management. So rescinding makes complete sense to me, because if you look in 10 years and they no longer meet that trigger point, then you would rescind it in my mind.
Thanks, Paul. Chris.
Yeah, so really quick, back to Stephanie's questions. I think it's a good one. It does make me think that, you know, as we keep talking about the details, ways to start to address that would be like the internal checks and balances that are baked into the system, including defining the arena for how the local council and DWR interact. And so thinking of things like the goal of the management plan must relate to the reason for designation. So why does the LGSA exist in the first place? And I know that gets to Grant's point, we need to have a fuller conversation about the criteria, and that's important too. And then also having a predefined, clear and predictable list of recommendations or requests that can be made by the council, so that it can't be anything. So I think there's opportunities to just structure that in a way that also respects the need that we hear from rural Arizona, the need for local choice, but then also there's the importance of having that state level implementation and accountability. And it's that sliding scale, right? And trying to figure out the right balance.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Bruce, this is Sharon. Could I just make a quick comment in response to Paul's comment of mine? I just indicated that I'd like to have discussion of this, and I could respond and give an example of where the triggering point could go away, but you would still want a council and local government stewardship area. So I just recommend discussion, and I think that's what's intended to happen. So I think that it's a big issue that we're not going to be able to get into the details of today.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Yeah, it's my understanding that this new third flexible tool would only be applicable in situations where you have, and I know we're talking about criteria, but basins at risk on a high level. And I would hope that any management plan, the reason for doing this is because we're trying to get as close to safe yield as possible. I mean, if you look at a lot of our rural communities, most of them in these areas, 100% dependent upon a groundwater basin. We don't have a canal system here. We don't have Colorado River water. And a lot of the local jurisdictions, they don't have the tax base to fund multi-million-dollar water infrastructure projects. So that really is paramount. And then second, there was some discussion about an INA and would an LGSA or this new tool replace an INA? And I would say you should be careful about that. And it'd be a good idea, except for the fact that under 11.812, there's one sentence in there that in Mojave County's interpretation of that, if you own 5 or more acres, you don't have to get any sort of a land use approval from a planning and zoning commission or a city council or a board of supervisors like you do with a residential, commercial, industrial project. So it's kind of an end run around a general plan process. So hopefully all that would be captured in this new tool.
I think those are all elements that we're going to have to discuss a little bit, especially the criteria, right? And when you move forward the LGSA versus other options, an AMA or an INA, right? What we've seen, at least in my opinion, INAs really don't address aquifer depletion. And so the LGSA is a little bit broader than that, dealing with aquifer issues and groundwater use.
Yeah, the INA, under state law, you have to wait until you're in crisis before you can declare one, and then really then it just helps the hole from getting any bigger. So
right. Thank you, Stephanie.
So just for clarification along Sandy's comment, on the implementation, is that an and or an or? In other words, for this plan to be approved, whoever the relevant entities are, which would be further clarified, I guess, is it that both those relevant entities and DWR must approve the plan, or they will coordinate to implement the plan?
I think it's more of a coordination to implement. It would be my suggestion where the director would have to have some autonomy to move forward with a plan.
I think the original legislation that we took this from also contemplated that the management plan could include components that the council may recommend that would not be implemented by ADWR, not within ADWR's authority, but could be implemented by cities, towns, tribes, or local water users. But those would obviously have to be voluntary, and if it's within those entities' authorities, then it would be up to them to implement it, and it's a recommendation of the council. So I think that is why there's coordination or consider and approve, if appropriate, the management actions. Like, the council can't order a city or a town to do something. I don't think that's the intent, but they can recommend that a city or town do something.
So would it be possible for there to be a scenario, and maybe you just said this and I heard it backwards, but so would it be possible for there to be a scenario where a recommendation could come out of the council that would really apply to a county or a city and not the state, but it would be something that the county or the city would not be able to implement other than the existence of this plan?
No, I don't think so. You're asking if the plan would create new authorities for the county or the city, and I don't think so. I think it's just that they could recommend actions that are within existing authorities.
As you can see, there's a lot of details that we're going to have to discuss. If I could go to the next slide, because I want to make sure that we get through these next two slides, and then it looks like we're going to have a homework assignment for all of you. So, Haley, this kind of talks about and summarizes what we believe are the role of the LGSA, and we can have some discussion on this, of course, and then we'll also have a slide that talks about the ADWR role. But LGSA initiates creation through petition, potentially participates at hearings on creating or rescinding an LGSA, recommends members to serve on council, draft and recommend a plan, goals, programs, water management practices, review and either recommend to readopt the plan, commission or create reports, seek and receive public and private monies to assist with the planning, management, and purpose, and then negotiate, make, execute, acknowledge, and perform any contract, agreement, or obligation it deems advisable. And much of this language came directly from the proposed legislation. So you may have some questions on the details of this, and I might have to turn to Chris and others to see if they can answer some of those questions. But much of this language came directly from the LGSA legislation. And I can see us refining this too. Is there something that we left out? So I'll ask each of you to review this.
Bruce, this is Sharon. Apologies because I couldn't make those other meetings. I had unavoidable conflicts. But I have a question about the title of the slide. When you say local role, when it comes to executing contracts, who are you talking about executing a contract?
Our use of local role is locally means those that reside within the LGSA that are involved on that are members of the council. But I guess I would ask others, when we talk about contracts, it'd be contracts that the council initiates with maybe other users to help with whatever the goals or objectives or plans are associated, or other items that are associated with the plan itself.
So Bruce, one of the reasons I asked that is that what is the legal status of the council or this LGSA? Because, like, for example, my recollection, I was never intimately involved, was like, let's take the Upper San Pedro Partnership, which I realized was not formed due to government, but the city of Sierra Vista may have taken a certain role to do some things on behalf. And my question is, who's issuing the contract and what's the legal kind of status of whom to issue a contract? So it's a very particular question that I have.
Any thoughts on that, Nicole?
Yeah, I think that we also had some questions about that, and we think that that is certainly a topic that we need to discuss before this actually, before this is all finalized, is, what are the types of contracts, agreements, and obligations that might be involved here, that are contemplated here, and then what are the other things that go along with that? So I think there is definitely a need for further discussion on some of these components.
And maybe Chris, I'd ask you, when the legislation was drafted, was there much discussion on this, on the contracts, agreements, and obligations?
So it was more of rounding out the council so that it could potentially do different things. I don't remember or recall like specific discussions, but it was giving them the option to contract, especially given the LGSA as it was introduced and then where it left off, there would be dedicated funding that would go to the department so that it could support like conservation actions, incentives. And so it was more of providing that option, but it's definitely worth further discussion.
Okay, thank you. Ron.
Ron Doba. I think that's a really good point. When I look at this, the question that comes to my mind is, would there be a need for an LGSA to apply for grants, for example? And if that's the case, would they qualify to be able to apply for these grants? Do they need to be a legal entity such as a 501c3, or could they form a 501c3 if they wanted to, so they'd be eligible for some federal monies? So just something that I don't know if we gave that much thought to.
Thank you. Next slide, please. The ADWR role: initiate LGSA creation if criteria is met, hold hearings on creating or rescinding an LGSA, provide technical assistance in drafting the plan, monitoring progress, review and approve the LGSA plan, remove components that are not legal and send back to council for revisions, enforce regulatory tools and programs allowed under statute. Questions on that? Okay, next slide. I don't think, is that the next slide? Okay. Can we go to the next slide after that? What I'd like to propose here, we have 15 minutes. Each of these framework components will go into significant discussion and will require us to do a much, much deeper dive. We just touched upon at a high level some of these issues itself. So what we'd like to do and propose is that there are 12, 15 slides 34 through 46, that go into a bit more detail on each of these issues. So what we'd like to propose as a homework assignment is that each of you review slides 34 through 36, provide thoughts, suggestions, review, analysis, and then what we would like to do is come back at the next subcommittee meeting, and we'll probably have to divide this up, but at the next subcommittee meeting, potentially we'll only discuss initiation and creation and council membership. But I want to make sure that we have enough time in these meetings to do a deeper dive and get a better understanding on the details and the language associated with this framework. So that's our suggestion for today. So what I'd like to do then is skip over those slides, and we can go directly to the measuring and monitoring slides.
Bruce, while you're doing that,
slides.
While you're doing that, may I make a comment?
Yes.
I find it extremely difficult, obviously, to make in Phoenix meetings due to late scheduling of meetings relative to how calendars get developed. And I really would like to ask there be consideration to allowing members of the subcommittee to participate via electronic means. And I think there are ways to do that. I just know it's going to be very difficult for me to add, my travel time and be available for when these meetings are scheduled with short notice. And I just have to put that on the record because I do feel somewhat disenfranchised from participation because you scheduled a meeting on my vacation, I can't make it from San Diego, et cetera, et cetera. But living in Tucson, it's going to be difficult sometimes for me to carve out those extra hours for travel, and I'd like to be able to participate. So I'm going to just put this on the record. You don't have to respond.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon.
Bruce, can I ask,
Grant, yes.
as staff, love homework assignments. How would you, is there going to be do we bring those to the next meeting? Do we submit those to the department, and will those be circulated prior to the meeting? How did you envision we would disseminate those ideas?
I think we could do both. We could either have it, just bring it and have it for discussion, or if you want to submit it to the department, we're happy to send that out to the rest of the group. So I think both. And I'm happy to reach out and have more discussion with each and every one of you before the next subcommittee meeting. Individually, if you'd like to do that too. Okay.
So, Grant, I think it's really important to be able to discuss the results of the homework assignment so you can add context and get into the details. Because no matter how much you write on a piece of paper in response, there's going to be questions. It's going to raise a lot of different thoughts in people's minds. So that's the value, I think, of having these discussions in this group, is to be able to go through it and put everything together. If you're asking, can we disseminate this ahead of time so people have a heads up about where you're going, that I think will help move the discussion forward in a more timely manner, so they at least have some heads up instead of just coming to a meeting and seeing 10 different responses and trying to put them all together in 2 hours.
Thank you. Measuring reporting, I'd like to go through this very, very quickly. And what I'd like to do is share the slides that we went through and also pass on to the committee that DWR did hear the responses, did listen to the members of the subcommittee, and that we will be coming forward to the subcommittee with more of a hybrid approach associated with measuring and monitoring. But if I could, I'll just go through these slides very, very quickly on what was discussed. First slide, please. There's limited information available for many of the basins. There's a need, as you all know, for additional monitoring data collection outside of the AMAs and INAs. And there are nearly 24,000 non-exempt wells outside the AMAs and INAs. We need to fill data gaps, which would increase understanding of the aquifer. Without measurement and monitoring, it's difficult to manage a system. By collecting and analyzing pumping data in a local area, we'll get a better understanding of the aquifer. So increased measuring and monitoring could also help prevent and limit pumping equipment failures. So there is some benefit to end users potentially too. Next slide, please. We discussed several alternatives: mandatory statewide reporting, volunteer statewide reporting with financial assistance, mandatory reporting in select non-regulated areas, such as the priority subbasins and subbasins, or maybe even chosen by a rate of decline or a lack of index wells, or just a total voluntary reporting program with financial assistance in selected non-regulated areas. So those would be like the priority basins and subbasins. Much of the discussion focused on the mandatory statewide reporting. So I can tell you that this hybrid approach won't be a mandatory element, but it'll be pieces of some of these potential methods. Next slide, please. Measuring and reporting requirements. I think the reason we put this up is that there are several different means in which you can measure water use at a well, and so we just wanted to remind folks that DWR accepts a wide variety of options and how you can measure your groundwater withdrawals. The thought was also that there would be an annual reporting with those that are required to measure and meter their water, and we discussed, not at length, but some level of penalty for not reporting the data. And then, of course, we want to make this as simple and easy as possible for those that will have to report their data. So we will be coming back to you with a hybrid approach. I'm hoping to have that soon, maybe within the next week, for something for you all to review. And we'll discuss that again at the next subcommittee meeting. Any questions on that? We did also talk about financial assistance options. I really think that provide the rebate for approved measuring device is more the financial option that would apply to by far the majority of the wells. The replace, repair domestic wells, conduct well evaluations would be more of a boutique approach to, there may be certain wells where that would provide significant value to the department where we may want to invest in those wells a little bit more than just providing a rebate for approved measuring devices. So we had some discussion on this, but I guess I would focus the committee on providing rebates for approved measuring devices would be the primary financial assistance option that we would want to focus upon. Ron.
Thanks, Bruce. I've been thinking about this a lot, and we've talked about it quite a bit for a long time about mandatory metering of non-exempt wells. And I know that there's a lot of folks that really believe that this is valuable data that we need to understand where we're going with our water situation in the state. And there's a lot of concerns that have been expressed in opposition to mandatory metering. But I personally, and I may be wrong, I've been wrong a lot, but I don't think it's the cost of the meters that are the issue. I don't think it's the effort that's involved in reading a meter once a year or whatever it is and filling out a form and sending it in, because a lot of people do that. Water systems do it. A lot of folks do it throughout the state. I think the concern that I've heard is a concern about, well, if I tell somebody how much water I'm using, it's going to come back and bite me somehow. I'm going to be regulated, or I'm facing the possibility of the amount of water that I need for what I'm doing being limited. And my thought is maybe we can get more folks buying in on this if we address that issue. So just for what it's worth.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. Sandy.
Thank you. There's a lot of conversations around this right now, and there are different groups, different folks getting together to have conversations and come up with alternatives and ideas around that. I think rather than us getting into those today, we'd like to see the hybrid first, and then we can develop that a bit further. So I think there is, obviously there's willingness for at least discussions at this point. So.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, next slide. Upcoming meetings and next steps. If we could go to the slide after that. There's not a lot of time between now and the next Rural Groundwater Committee meeting. So what I'd like to do is suggest that at the next Rural Groundwater Committee meeting, you all come prepared. We'll have the hybrid example to discuss, and you all come prepared to discuss the homework assignment. And we'll also get a agenda out in advance, because again, I don't think we're going to be able to discuss all the components of the LGSA. So we'll try to focus on what are some of the more significant areas where we're going to have more detailed, deeper dive discussion with the committee. So no rural groundwater subcommittee meeting, but let's just focus in on the September 14th date for the rural groundwater committee meeting. And then of course, there's an upcoming Governor's Water Policy Council meeting where we're going to need to report to the full council on the effort and where we're at here with our committee. Okay. So next steps, members review components, be prepared to discuss any changes or additions, review and discuss the proposal, of course, with your constituents and colleagues. Again, we'll provide review and input from today's meeting, and then we'll be prepared to share the hybrid proposal, and we'll share that sooner rather than later. Any final? I think that's the last slide, isn't it? Is there a question? Yes, Stephanie.
Not a question. I just wanted to offer some comments of support to Sharon's concerns about the meeting dates. The ones that we have set so far, I don't think are a problem, but I think everybody that participates in this process started out with an extremely busy schedule already set 6 months in advance.
Yeah.
And I think all of us feel the importance of this process. And so I guess I would just reiterate her request that somehow that call-in or virtual option be available for all of these meetings. However, that has to happen under the structure of those meetings. But I would just also just add my own concern and struggle to Sharon's comments.
Thank you. Last slide, and any final comments? Director Bishotsky?
So just thanks to everybody again, and thanks for the time commitment, and we understand how difficult that is, but I wanted to make one last comment. Our statewide planning manager, John Riggins, who has been involved in this process and has done a lot of work over the years he's been here, in various venues, including going out into rural Arizona in the planning area process in our prior lives. He is going off to WIFA, to the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority. So tomorrow will be his last day. I just wanted to thank him. And John was our manager over the supply and demand analysis. Natalie sat up here and went through it, and Natalie's going to add another plate for her to juggle until we are able to hire some new people. But John's been a really impactful employee for us and has done a great job. And you may not have always necessarily seen John front and center, but a lot of the work you're seeing here has come out of John and John's people. So thanks to John. And good luck in WIFA.
Thank you, everyone, and that concludes today's committee meeting.